Today, we will be talking with Professor Aaron Passell, who is the Associate Director of Urban Studies at Barnard College. His research has focused on the social aspect of creating and building environments, neighborhoods, and their preservation, as well as topics in urbanization. Professor Passell has also authored Preserving Neighborhoods and Building the New Urbanism. To start us off today, we would like to ask a question about you, Professor. What was your inspiration to become an expert in urban sociology? Do you have a personal connection to the subject matter?
Yes. Well, first of all, thanks for this opportunity and nice to meet you both. For me, sort of my involvement in urban sociology is sort of a chicken and egg problem. I've always been interested in cities. I grew up mostly just outside of Boston, spending a lot of time visiting Boston and walking around downtown. And then Paris as a college student, moving to San Francisco after college, and so sort of living in a range of cities over my relatively early life. I was always fascinated, and so always fascinated, always interested in the built environment, interested in architecture, interested in how people interacted with the city around them and with the people around them. And that sort of led relatively naturally to urban sociology. So I came to graduate school in New York at NYU, which at some level furthered my interests in urbanism, and then somewhat contradictorily actually undertook doctoral research on suburban development. And so shifted to thinking about sort of metropolitanism more broadly, thinking about cities and suburbs, their relationships, how the environment of suburbs emerges as important in the United States, et cetera, et cetera. And it's taken me a little while to shift back towards really urban concerns. So as my most recent book, which you mentioned a moment ago, really got me working in central Brooklyn and in Baltimore, thinking about particular issues of regulating urban spaces, which is honestly where my interests have been sort of deepest for most of my life and career. But the foundations in thinking about regulation and professions and the political economy of development that I got from earlier work on suburban development was essential for me to get where I eventually got.
It's funny, Anna's also from Boston as well.
Fellow Bostonian.
Excellent.
Was there something in particular that pushed you back into research on more gentrification, from like a switch, or did you just miss it? Was there something that brought you back?
Honestly, I think teaching.
Mm-hmm.
So my relatively early work on suburban design and development emerged from a sort of central sociological concern, which was that the design and development movement that I was interested in, called the New Urbanism, believed in the possibility of designing for a community. And so I encountered this relatively early in my time in graduate school, and thought that this was amazing, that there were architects and urban designers and planners who thought that they could design for community, when sociologists, who I believed were supposed to be expert in the subject, couldn't agree on what community meant. So the beginning was really there, in this sort of sociological set of questions about the relationship between the built environment and community life. And I tried to stay away from assessing or evaluating in that early work. I decided it wasn't my job to determine whether they were right that they could build community, but rather how they arrived at an effort to try to do so. So I'm sorry, this is a long answer. If you were in my classes, you know I only give long answers. But so that was a sort of set of sociological concerns that moved me forward into research and a career as a sociologist. And the more chances I got to teach urban sociology, and the more teaching of urban sociology I did, the more it became apparent to me that gentrification was a topic which got students excited, but also was one that captured a huge range of the really critical phenomena about urbanism generally, um, changing demographics of cities, the history of segregation and marginalization in American cities, the political economy of development, the built environment itself. So that's to the degree that gentrification has featured in classes, and now more recently in my research, it's because of this discovery that it was a concept that was so multifaceted, robust, as among other things, a teaching tool.
So a particular neighborhood in New York that we are interested in understanding better is Washington Heights, which is known as a heavily Dominican neighborhood. More broadly, how do cities develop distinct neighborhoods with associated culture groups, and why is their preservation so important?
So there are two pieces of the question, one of which I want to try to spell out a little bit, I say a little bit about, and the other of which I want to argue a little bit. So first, we talk about, sort of as urban sociologists in general, we talk about neighborhoods like Washington Heights as ethnic enclaves. So ethnic enclaves emerge from a whole range of processes, right? The sort of positive, the positive incentives for forming ethnic enclaves emerge from the abilities of communities to provide for culturally specific needs, right? So if you're looking for the ingredients you need for cooking Dominican meals, much easier to do so in grocery stores, which provide food specific to the foodways emerging from the Dominican Republic and recreated in the States. So there are important sort of positives around ethnic enclaves that emerge from those sort of cultural services, but the foundations of the provision of those services is often also in sort of community cooperation agreements. I don't know Washington Heights well enough, but it is sometimes the case, particularly in Chinese immigrant communities, that there is some sort of cooperative financing of culturally appropriate commercial entities in these neighborhoods, where the neighborhood has somehow cooperated. Some number of people with some small disposable capital have agreed to work together to fund the sorts of things that will help the neighborhood survive and sustain itself. So those are the sorts of positive things that lead towards ethnic enclaves. It's critical to note too that that there are negatives, right? That there are issues around segregation in the real estate market that direct populations who are racialized or ethnicized as other than white or other than the prominent population in the area, and then segregated to those parts of cities. So again, I don't know the history of Washington Heights well enough, but it's almost certainly the case that there are important reasons why the spaces of Washington Heights are available to people of relatively lower income and who are ethnicized or racialized as other. And that's about the long history of disinvestment in some neighborhoods as opposed to others across New York City, like in most other American cities. So that's just a little bit on sort of ethnic enclaves, you know, the goods and the bads at some level. And I think that's just a beginning. There's much more to be said. But I want to argue just a little bit with the idea of the preservation of ethnic enclaves. And first I want to say, obviously for the people who inhabit them, their ongoing existence as places that serve the needs of a culturally relatively specific population are important, right? For exactly the reasons I just mentioned, when trying to think about ethnic enclaves, to the degree that people still need culturally specific, services of any range, whether it's through, as I mentioned before, or things like legal services in the language they're most comfortable in, or any range of things like that, right? So those are important things for sustaining a community, but also for simply accomplishing the needs of people living in the city. What I want to be careful about, and I think this may go to some of your other questions too, is making sure that we are thinking about the intentions, motivations, and choices of people living in those communities, and not resorting to a sort of top-down planning or even protection of those communities. The history of ethnic enclaves in the United States has frequently involved the out-movement from those ethnic enclaves of communities as they establish themselves socioeconomically. I lived in Astoria, Queens, when I was in graduate school, which historically had a really significant Greek population, and at the time that I was living there, there was still evidence of Astoria's Greek population. There were Greek restaurants. I think there was still significant Greek population in the neighborhood, but at the same time, the Greek population a lot of it had moved out as it had gotten more professionally established, as it had been more assimilated into sort of American educational systems, things like that. And so I responded to this idea of preservation in your question by wanting to make sure to emphasize that to the degree that the nature of the ethnic enclave supports a community who chooses to remain in place, it seems like something that we should feel good about. But I also imagine and hope that people within the community of Washington Heights, some of them are aspiring to living in other ways, presumably, and in other places. And I think that we should expect that an ethnic enclave involves some out-movement.
So you mentioned the process of ethnicizing, and particularly in terms of verbalism, using terms as other than or non-white communities. So I guess I have a broad question about stigmatization and the role that, verbalism plays in creating that and how that contributes to gentrification. I think that's a very broad question.
Thinking hard about neighborhoods and the ways in which we construct neighborhood difference. I think it's essential to think both, and I'm borrowing from lots of scholarship, particularly I'm thinking about the work of Robert Sampson on Chicago. It's important to think both about how neighborhoods define themselves and how the rest of the city thinks of a neighborhood. There is a sort of inside-outside discourse piece, which is really important. I think there are claims to space, right? Ethnic communities make claims to neighborhoods being their spaces, and they do so in various terms. I think the Dominican population in New York City is a really interesting one in the sense that it is variously racialized and makes claims to the construction of racialized difference in the United States in various ways. Right, there are African Dominicans, there are Dominicans who don't identify with African Americans, et cetera, right? So there's that process of sort of the discourse of claiming, but then there is also, as you point out, a process of thinking about the neighborhood from outside and constructing it in various ways, sometimes otherizing it, sometimes marginalizing it, and that comes with a variety of consequences. So one of the consequences, I think, is the sort of resegregation of neighborhoods, the denial of resources like real estate lending, the constraint of real estate sales, the constraint of new investment in neighborhoods because of the construction of the neighborhood as racially other. And of course, we should note that those things are illegal in the United States. Those practices, they are nevertheless ongoing. But I also want to suggest that there is scholarship, which I'm still struggling with a little bit, about the value in ethnic difference for some people. Japonica Brown Saraceno calls some people social preservationists, who I might call gentrifiers, or at least early stage gentrifiers. She writes about groups of people who value people from relatively dominant social categories or privileged social categories who value ethnic difference and consume that and attempt to consume that ethnic difference by moving into communities that are constructed differently than their own backgrounds. And so this is one of the reasons I struggle with this, is because it describes me to some degree. I'm a foodie. Like, I like to go all over the city to find cuisines that have little to do with my own ethnic background. Does that put me in a problematic situation? I lived in a predominantly Mexican neighborhood in San Francisco almost 30 years ago, a neighborhood that has since radically gentrified. I suspect I was part of a process that I have major concerns about, in part because of the value I placed on the opportunity to live in a neighborhood like that one. Let me just quickly say one more thing, which is it's very rare that the demographics of a US city neighborhood are absolutely uniform.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things for us to keep in mind, broadly, as we think about these things in general, is that what we're referring to as a Dominican neighborhood undoubtedly has lots of people living in it, and has for years, who are not, in fact, descended from people from the Dominican Republic, and it's so that any effort, any work we do to characterize a neighborhood is almost always obscuring some kind of diversity.
Mm-hmm.
I think one thing I'm struggling with in terms of understanding is, should we try to keep the other, like in terms of the term other? Because, if we continue to develop, for example, if there are gentrifiers in Washington Heights who are trying to put more resources into it, or trying to make it a better community for specifically the Dominican population there, would that be a good thing because we're providing them resources? Or is it better that we're kind of creating a melting pot by displacing everybody and kind of putting everyone in the same community? So is it better to have the other, or to have it kind of be a melting pot?
So there's no way I can answer that question, but it's a great question. It's exactly the right sort of question to be asking, right? And what this is one of the things I talk about in class all the time, right? Stepping away from the language of gentrification and trying to talk in general about neighborhood change, let me tell you a story about a changing neighborhood. It's been radically disinvested for decades because of a whole set of federal programs and et cetera, et cetera. It's segregated, and the people who live there don't have good access to city politics. They don't have good access to city services. They don't have loud voices in terms of calling for the improvement of public education, et cetera, et cetera. Then some group of people, some people sort of incrementally over time move into this neighborhood, who bring with them more political power, the ability to attract resources and services to this neighborhood. in a classroom, we call that diversification, right? We look for diverse classrooms as opposed to uniform or segregated classrooms. We refer to this as integration, right? It's absolutely appropriate to be concerned with the displacement aspects of gentrification, but it is also worth thinking very hard about the possibilities that if people can remain in place by choice and still find the sorts of services that they need to survive comfortably and culturally appropriately, give or take, then neighborhood change is something that we should be aspiring to, at least in some circumstances. So because I've seen some of the questions you guys are considering before, right, I know that that in general these are the things you're thinking about, but and I just want to throw in now that that's my primary concern about gentrification, is maintaining the ability for people who choose to stay in place to do so. And honestly, I think that there's a relatively simple answer to that, which is a New York City answer, and that's rent stabilization.
Mm-hmm.
That rent stabilization is actually an extremely valuable tool in maintaining the possibility for people to stay in place. And rent stabilization has its shortcomings, right? The buildings have to be 6 units or larger. There's a threshold above which rents get destabilized. There are all these sorts of problems with rent stabilization. Landlords hate it, right? There are all these problems with rent stabilization, but it is a device which exists almost nowhere else in the United States that enables people who choose to stay in place.
So since you mentioned rent stabilization as a potential solution,
Mhm.
or a potential means to let people stay if they want to stay where they want to stay.
Yep.
If this is such a great solution and a great method to do so, why is it not being more widely implemented?
I think the short answer is because it constrains the profits of landowners.
Mm-hmm.
So it's given that one of the most powerful political forces in New York City is the real estate industry. Any regulation in New York City that constrains the ability to make profits through real estate is inevitably going to be unpopular and difficult to implement.
Mm-hmm.
It's maybe this is too cynical and oversimplified, but I'm not sure. It runs directly counter to the profit interests of very wealthy and politically powerful people.
Well, since we started talking about preservation, let's
Mhm.
switch gears to the next question.
Sure.
So in your book, Preserving Neighborhoods, you discuss the ways in which historic preservation leads to gentrification and contributes to rising property values, leading to displacement. Is there a way in which you see historic preservation being used for good, perhaps a way to slow down the rapid changes of neighborhoods due to increased urbanization?
So actually, I want to start by correcting something.
Okay.
The initial interest for the research that led to the book was in the misperception that historic preservation regulation uniformly leads to gentrification, displacement, increasing property prices. It's not the case across the board that that's what happens. In a shrinking and shrunk city like Baltimore, there's a radical diversity of impacts on neighborhoods. In some neighborhoods, it may in fact be that historic district designation triggers a process that looks a lot like gentrification. The neighborhood in which that's clearest was a working class white neighborhood, which is in the process of becoming an upper middle class white neighborhood. So it raises another set of questions about ethnicity and people's interest in and tolerance for racialized or ethnic difference in residential spaces. But then in my central Brooklyn cases, the neighborhoods I was interested in, Prospect Heights, Crown Heights North, those neighborhoods are well along the process of gentrification long before they historically designate. So there's no sense in which the historic district designation process triggered a gentrification process. Rather, it's the residents of those neighborhoods looking to any intervention they can find in an effort to control processes totally out of their control in the neighborhoods that they inhabit. So starting with that clarification, but also giving a little bit more sort of about the way historic district designation at least works in various cities. The answer, I think, about positives associated with historic district designation are ultimately, I think, about community building. So what I saw in both Brooklyn and Baltimore was that efforts to designate a neighborhood as historic and efforts to maintain the historic integrity of the neighborhood brought people together, working together on what became a range of neighborhood concerns. So, for instance, one of the sort of neighborhoods that shows up in my book is Crown Heights South, which does not yet have what we call in New York City a landmark district, and has been engaged in an effort to landmark at least parts of the neighborhood, and that effort has as yet been frustrated. Nevertheless, it is bringing a large number of people together to talk about issues of affordable housing, about rapid neighborhood change, about the form of the neighborhood and their preferences for that form. So even in an instance that we would normally regard as failure, there's a kind of community resource generation in the effort. And then by contrast, in a neighborhood like Crown Heights North, there's a robust neighborhood association that is involved in the maintenance of the landmark district, but is also working with seniors about on issues of predatory lending, working to maintain small-scale commercial establishments where there's pressure from new chain stores. Things like that, and so again, in a more successful context of landmark designation, there is this really significant community resource development process.
So also gentrification is often, how we kind of talked before, gentrification is often associated with the migration of new residents into a neighborhood, raising housing costs overall for the local residents, who are usually forced to move out. Do you believe that gentrification can often lead to shrinking cities, or is the depopulation counterbalanced by the influx of new residents?
So I think this is sort of a terminological problem. It's shrinking cities mostly refers to cities that have encountered really significant population decline over time, and in general in the United States, that's post-1950s, white flight, et cetera. And we can name a whole bunch of cities that encountered sort of radical population loss and abandonment, like Buffalo, St. Louis, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, cities like that, Philadelphia too. By contrast, gentrification usually produces a decrease in population in a neighborhood. It's a kind of de-densification, as so Central Brooklyn is a great example. Late 19th century brownstone townhouses had been split up into 3 or 4 apartments, sometimes more, sometimes rooming houses, which then meant that there were 3 to 4 families, 10 to 12 people, the rooming houses even more. And then as gentrification occurred in neighborhoods like Prospect Heights, those houses were converted back to their original single family status. So there's a significant loss in population every time 3 families are replaced with 1. But at the same time, that's not that's not what we mean usually by shrinking cities, which brings with them a whole lot, a loss of tax revenue, an inability to continue to provide city services, those sorts of things. Because among other things, in gentrifying neighborhoods, tax revenues associated with real property values tend in fact to increase. So the city can still provide the sorts of services, or even often better services in that neighborhood, as opposed to losing the ability to provide services in that neighborhood. Does that make sense as a distinction?
Yes. So I just have one question about the term shrinking cities.
Yeah.
Shrinking cities just means that the population decreases. It's not a term exclusively used for gentrification.
Definitely not. In general, shrinking cities refers to cities encountering major population loss and the loss of jobs and et cetera, et cetera. So really, I think St. Louis is the most remarkable example. Between 1950 and the present, I think St. Louis lost 2/3 of its population. And there are a large number of cities, famously Detroit, right, wrestling with with population loss and the problems of abandoned residential spaces. Baltimore, this is true too. And there are very few where that's actually turned around. So Philadelphia actually showed population growth between 2000 and 2010 for the first time since 1950. And I think that Pittsburgh has stabilized in terms of its population loss, but they're relatively rare examples of large industrial cities that had a great deal of population loss after 1950 that have, in Philadelphia's case, started to grow. If you look at the recent good research on homelessness, what you will find is that homelessness is a phenomenon associated with housing affordability. There's been a lot of debate about the sources of homeless populations, sort of in at least sociology, other fields over time. There are lots of conspicuous homeless people, some of whom they may find themselves homeless as a product of deinstitutionalization from places where they were receiving care. But there's an overwhelming, inconspicuous homeless population. Families who are doubling up with friends and family members who are, squeezed into temporary housing, things like that. And that is really about a lack of affordability, particularly in cities like